We need to have a very serious, very direct, and completely honest conversation about multiple significant developments that have emerged from the Indiana Fever and Phoenix Mercury situation. Because there are three distinct and equally important stories that all demand honest, analytical engagement simultaneously. The WNBA has issued a suspension. Stephanie White went to the podium and tried to use Caitlin Clark as a shield. And the narrative about Clark being benched versus leaving with a back injury has new evidence attached to it. All of it belongs in the complete accounting of what this situation has produced. Let us work through each dimension with the clarity and the honesty it deserves. Let us begin with the most significant institutional development first, because it represents the WNBA actually doing something right in a situation where its institutional response has been criticized repeatedly and legitimately throughout this season. The WNBA released a statement confirming that Phoenix Mercury center Alyssa Thomas has received a flagrant 2 penalty and a 1-game suspension for reckless contact involving her fist making contact with the throat of Indiana Fever guard Caitlin Clark. The incident was documented as occurring with approximately 6 minutes and 52 seconds remaining in the second quarter of the Phoenix Mercury's 111-109 victory over the Fever. Under WNBA rules, the league has the authority, following post-game review, to reclassify fouls, impose flagrant classifications on contact that was not called during the game, and issue fines or suspensions based on that review. The league exercised that authority. Thomas will serve her suspension when the Mercury next play. This is the institutional accountability that the situation demanded. The contact that was documented, physical engagement with Clark, that occurred in a space and at a moment where no legitimate basketball play was being made, the kind of conduct that the league's player safety obligations exist specifically to address, has now been formally reviewed and formally penalized. The suspension is real. The flagrant 2 designation is formal. The league acted. And yet, and this is the honest analytical dimension that cannot be glossed over in the celebration of the institutional response, the question that remains is whether a 1-game suspension is proportionate to what was documented. Clark is the most commercially significant player in the history of this sport. She is the player whose presence generates the revenue and the viewership that fund the entire institutional enterprise. The contact directed at her in this game was sufficiently serious to warrant a flagrant 2 and a suspension. The length of that suspension is 1 game. Whether the deterrent effect of that specific penalty is sufficient to protect Clark from comparable conduct going forward, from this opponent or from others who observe what the cost is a legitimate institutional question that the league's leadership needs to engage with honestly. But the suspension is documented. It happened. The WNBA acted within its authority and imposed a consequence. That deserves acknowledgement. Now let us address Stephanie White's post-game podium performance, because it represents one of the most analytically significant coaching communications failures of this entire season. And this is a season that has produced significant coaching communication failures on a documented and recurring basis. White went to the podium following the loss and proceeded to deploy Caitlin Clark's name and Caitlin Clark's situation as the primary explanatory framework for what went wrong in this game.
During the game, have you seen that? Did that have any impact on her health in this one?
I just saw it. I'm not sure if it had any impact on her health or not. But it was egregious. The fact that it was a no call. I heard about it at halftime. I brought it to the attention of the officials at halftime. Yet we still had 11 fouls in the fourth quarter to their 2. They still shot 24 free throws in the second half. Number one, you got to call it. It's absolutely egregious and utterly disrespectful. And then number two, you're coming in here aware of what happened 2 nights ago, and that shit still happens? Absolutely unacceptable. Absolutely unacceptable. And the reckless closeout that they actually review, and the foot still comes down on top of the defender's foot that wasn't upgraded? Absolutely disrespectful. We have a generational talent and a WNBA superstar who had 2 cheap shots right there that weren't called. And I just say again, absolutely unacceptable.
She talked about Clark. She mentioned what Clark experienced. She used the physical targeting directed at Clark as the lens through which she was asking observers to understand the competitive result. Let that specific choice be named directly. This is the same coaching staff that game after game across this entire season has produced documented patterns of not acknowledging Clark's contributions at the podium, not centering Clark's performances in post-game credit allocation, and requiring organizational infrastructure workarounds to ensure Clark's name even gets mentioned in locker room addresses following historic individual performances. And now, after a loss, suddenly Clark's name is the first thing out of White's mouth at the podium. The analytical question is straightforward. Is White genuinely and newly committed to centering Clark in her public communications? Or is she using Clark's situation, the back injury, the physical targeting by Thomas, the dramatic circumstances surrounding Clark's departure, as a cover for the coaching decisions that contributed to this loss and that deserve their own direct accountability? Because here is what the podium conversation about refs and physical conduct deflects from. White pulled Clark at the end of the first quarter when Clark had 13 points and was on a heater. She pulled Clark at the end of the second quarter when Clark was producing elite output and was in competitive rhythm. She kept Kelsey Mitchell on the floor for 19 of the 20 available first-half minutes while Clark played 14. These are the coaching decisions that happened in this game. These are the decisions that belong in the post-game accountability conversation alongside everything that Thomas did and alongside the officiating failures that occurred. Blaming the refs, whose conduct was genuinely problematic and who failed to protect Clark from physical targeting throughout this game, is not wrong on the merits. The officiating was poor. The failure to call the Thomas contact in real time was an officiating accountability failure. But deploying that accurate criticism of officiating as the primary explanatory frame for the loss, while avoiding any accountability for the specific coaching decisions made in the first half, is using a legitimate grievance to avoid a separate and equally legitimate accountability conversation. White knows Clark's name. She deployed it at the podium. And the analytical community that has been tracking the pattern of when and how Clark's name appears in White's post-game communications cannot ignore the specific circumstance in which it has now most prominently appeared. It appeared in a loss, after Clark was targeted physically, after Clark departed with a back issue, after White had made coaching decisions in the first half that deserve their own examination. In that specific context, suddenly Clark is centered in the post-game communication. That is the full picture of what the podium produced, and it deserves to be described honestly. Now, let us address the Clark back injury narrative and what new evidence has emerged about what actually happened. Because the analytical community has an obligation to be as accurate about this as it is about everything else it examines. The narrative that emerged in some corners of the fan and analytical community following the game suggested that Clark may have been benched by White rather than having genuinely left with a back issue. That theory pointed to the sequence of the turnover, White's visible agitation, the timeout, Clark's removal, and what was characterized as the absence of visible training staff involvement in Clark's departure. All of those observations were grounded in footage that was available and were analytically honest responses to what that footage showed. However, there is now new testimony from someone who was physically present at the game, not watching a broadcast, not analyzing footage after the fact, but in the building, who has stated clearly that Clark's back was genuinely hurting her and that the back issue was real. This first-hand account deserves the same analytical respect that the footage examination received. It represents a different category of evidence, direct observation from someone with physical presence at the location where the events occurred. And it carries weight that footage analysis from the outside cannot match. What the full picture appears to show when all available evidence is examined together honestly is more complex than either the straightforward injury narrative or the straightforward benching narrative individually captures. Clark did appear to have genuine back discomfort during this game. That physical issue was real. At the same time, White did make coaching decisions, pulling Clark at the end of the first half multiple times, keeping Mitchell on the floor for 19 of 20 first-half minutes that belong in the accountability conversation about this game, regardless of what eventually happened with the back situation. And the sequence in the third quarter, the turnover, White's visible response, the timeout, the removal, remains part of the documented record, even if the departure that followed was connected to a genuine physical issue. The intellectual honesty that this analysis requires is acknowledging that the complete truth of what happened is probably not fully captured by any single narrative. Clark's back was genuinely an issue. White's coaching decisions in the first half were genuinely problematic. The Thomas conduct was genuinely targeted and physically harmful. The officiating genuinely failed to protect Clark in real time. The WNBA's suspension response was genuinely necessary and genuinely arrived. All of these things can be simultaneously true, and the honest analytical framework holds all of them simultaneously, rather than forcing any single explanatory story to bear the weight of the entire situation. The coaching decisions that put Clark in fewer minutes than Mitchell in the first half, that repeatedly removed Clark from the game when she was producing elite output, are coaching decisions that belong in the accountability record of this game, regardless of whether Clark ultimately left with a genuine back injury. Those decisions happened before the back situation became the primary story. They represent the coaching pattern that has been documented across this entire season and that contributed to a competitive result where Indiana lost to a team that won 5 games all year. 19 of 20 first-half minutes for Mitchell, 14 for Clark. Clark had 13 points and was cooking when she was pulled at the end of the first quarter. These are not contested observations. They are documented. And they belong in the conversation about why Indiana lost this game with the same analytical weight as everything else that occurred. The Thomas suspension vindicates every observer who characterized what she did as conduct that required institutional response. The one-game penalty is the league's initial response. Whether it represents sufficient deterrence going forward is a question the league needs to continue examining as the season produces more competitive encounters where Clark's physical safety becomes a competitive consideration. What this situation, in all of its complexity, with all of its simultaneous storylines, reveals about where this Indiana Fever season is and where it is heading is the analytical question that sits beneath all of the individual developments. Clark's back health is now a genuine concern that affects everything about Indiana's competitive prospects. The coaching decisions that surrounded her in this game, the first-half minutes distribution, the multiple removals during productive stretches, are part of the accountability picture, regardless of what happened with the back situation. The Thomas suspension is the right institutional outcome. White's podium performance represents a pattern that the analytical community should continue examining with the same consistency it has applied all season. All of it is real, all of it is documented, and all of it belongs in the honest and complete accounting of what this Indiana Fever season has been. A season that has consistently produced multiple simultaneous stories, each of which requires honest examination rather than selection of a single explanatory framework to stand in for the full and complicated truth. The WNBA suspended Thomas. The podium was White, using Clark's name as a shield. The back issue was genuine. The coaching decisions in the first half deserve their own accountability, and Indiana lost to a team that won 5 games all year. Every one of those statements is accurate. Every one of them belongs in the complete analytical record, and the work of honest examination continues for as long as this season produces the circumstances that make it necessary.